The next lesson we will be looking at qualitative and quantitative data. You need to know what qualitative data is and what quantitative data is, and you also need to be able to write a description for each and evaluate each one. So you need to know the strengths of collecting quantitative data and the strengths of collecting qualitative data and the weaknesses as well. So that's what we're going to be looking at now and in our next lesson. Qualitative data is whenever you collect data that is more detailed or rich than would be generated, for example, from a closed question. For example, if you were designing a self-report and you were using a questionnaire to investigate people's happiness or how happy people are, a closed question might be, are you happy? And people would choose from a fixed response of yes or no. If you wanted to generate qualitative data, that question would not be suitable. So you would need to use an open question. For example, describe what makes you happy. In this way, somebody can describe all that makes them happy and elaborate and provide more detail than they could with the fixed response. Another way of obtaining qualitative data is to observe behaviour. Now, this could be part of a controlled observation in an experiment or a naturalistic observation or participant observation. For example, Rose and Han also recorded how often the patients were ignored by nurses and doctors, which provided quantitative data, but he also recorded examples of what the nurses said or what the doctors did, things like that, which would all be examples of behaviour and would be qualitative. Also, if you think of Freud's study with little Hans, the details about little Hans's phobias and his dreams and his fantasies would all be qualitative data. So lots of studies will collect both types of data. The main problem with qualitative data, although it is detailed and rich and does allow, particularly in self-report, for respondents to elaborate or explain their choices or their beliefs, it can be more difficult to analyse, and if you're wanting to do comparisons between groups, it can be more difficult to analyse than quantitative would be. Quantitative is our second type of data, and it's easy to remember because QUAN, N for numbers, so quantitative is all the data which would contain numbers. In a self-report, this would be our closed question. We have one there to the right asking people your age group and they select one, or the example I gave on the previous slide, are you happy, yes or no, and you record how many people said yes and how many said no, and you compare the responses. That would be quantitative data. If you were doing an observation, whilst we were saying that qualitative data could be detailed descriptions of what people were doing or saying, quantitative data from an observation would be recording frequencies of behaviour. So for example, if you were doing an observation looking at people's mobile phone use, you could record how often people texted, how often people used their phones to make phone calls, how often they used it to send email, etc. And you would have frequencies and you would have numbers. We can also collect quantitative data if we're recording time. So if you were comparing people's concentration when they're listening to music or not listening to music, and you wanted them to complete a crossword puzzle to see under which condition they completed it more quickly, you could record their time in seconds or minutes, and that would be quantitative data as well. Quantitative data is useful for generating descriptive statistics, the mean, the mode, the median, or producing bar charts, etc. Or if you're doing a correlation, you would collect quantitative data. So it's useful for summarising the data that you have recorded in a very easy way and very easy to make comparisons between groups. The disadvantage obviously would be that it is less detailed. Back to the earlier question of are you happy? Yes or no. Very quick for people to respond to that. However, it doesn't really explain why somebody has responded yes or why they've responded no. We don't really know why they're happy, we just know that they are. So a question like that could be supplemented with a qualitative open-ended question so that we could find out why they have responded in that way. Now your task for the next lesson is to take 3 of the course studies. So we have Sperry and his work with the participants who had the split brain, Thigpen and Cleckley and their work with Eve White, Eve Black and Jane, and Pillyavan et al. And their work in the subway study and looking at helping behaviour. For each of those studies, I want you to find 2 examples. One example should be qualitative data that was collected, and the other example should be a piece of quantitative data that was collected. So for each of them, you will have 2 bits of data, one qualitative, one quantitative. And I want you, for each type of data, I want you to write down what an advantage and a disadvantage of the qualitative and quantitative data is. So Sperry, for example, you will write down number 1, a piece of quantitative data, an example of that, with an advantage and disadvantage of that type of data, and then a piece of qualitative data that was collected by Sperry, and again an advantage and disadvantage of that type of data. And then repeat for Thigpen and Cleckley and Pillyavan et al. And we've chosen these 3 studies because each of these studies does collect both types of data. So if you have that ready for class on Wednesday, and that's what we'll start off with, looking at the course studies and their use of qualitative and quantitative. The next thing that you have to do is you have to go down to the quiz on this page and complete the online quiz. And remember, keep trying until you get 100%.